We're sewing up another seasonal favorite today. This is a cardigan jacket using Kwik Sew 4162. I recently discovered a new-to-me fabric company called Beglarian Fabrics. They have a wide selection of excellent quality dead stock fabrics. The fabric that I'm using today is one of their French terries. I've substituted the stable knit today for the pattern that calls for woven fabrics. I often use French terry as a woven substitute because it often creates a much cozier version of what you would get with a woven fabric. It also makes setting in your sleeves a breeze. There's no need to pre-sew easing stitches into your sleeve cap. I just use the natural minimal stretch of the French terry to ease my sleeve perfectly into the armhole. I've left links to both the fabric and the pattern below so you can check out all the details. I hope you join me in sewing today. Grab your materials and let's get started. I've transferred the dart onto the wrong side of my front bodice piece, and now I'm ready to pin it in place. I'm going to fold the dart in half and pin through one dart leg and out the other. Doing this for both front bodice pieces. Then we'll take the darts to the sewing machine and sew from the outer edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so you can tie them in knots. And then press your darts downward. Now we're going to pin the back darts. I've traced both of the darts onto the wrong side of the back bodice. Now I'm going to fold each dart in half as before, once again pinning through one side and out the other. Doing this on both sides. Then we're going to take both darts to the sewing machine and sew from one point, following your stitching line to the top, leaving thread tails at both ends to tie both ends in knots. And then press those darts toward the center back. Now place your front and back pieces right sides together and pin your shoulder seams. Also pin both of your side seams. Then sew both of your shoulder seams and both of your side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish in your preferred method. I'm going to be using my serger. To reduce bulk at my adjoining seams moving forward, I chose to serge both sides of the seams separately and press them open, for the side seams and the shoulder seams. And now at this point for the bottom of the jacket, we want to finish the raw edges from one side all the way to the other. You can use a zigzag stitch, an overcast stitch, or your serger. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of one set of front band pieces, and then place these pieces right sides together and pin the center back seam. And do the same for your non-interface set. Sew both center back seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Here is one of my band pieces with that seam opened out flat. Place both the interfaced and non-interface bands right sides together and pin along the front edges, making sure to match up those center back seams. Also pin along the bottom edges on both sides of the band. Now we're going to sew the bottom and front edges all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim those sewn corners, as well as all those seam allowances by about half. Now you can turn your band right side out, poking out those bottom corners. And then give that seam a good press. Once the sewn edge is pressed, we're going to pin together the raw open edges all the way across. And then we're going to baste those edges together from one end straight across to the opposite bottom end using the longest stitch on your machine and about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. On your front band pattern piece, you have dots indicating where the band will meet the shoulder seam. I've marked those dots here with pins. Also, on the bottom of your front bodice pattern piece, you have dots indicating where your band will start and stop at the bottom of the bodice. And I've marked those points here with pins as well. Now place the non-interface side of your band right sides together with your front bodice, placing the bottom edge of the band at the dot that you transferred to the bottom of the bodice. And pin in place. On both sides. Then you can match the dot at the top of the band with the bodice shoulder seam and pin in place. Again, doing that on both sides. Also match the center back of your back bodice with the seam of your neckband and pin in place, and then continue pinning around the rest of the band. Once you have that band pinned to the bodice all around the opening, we're going to take the bottom edge of the bodice that extends beyond the dot and fold this bottom of the bodice up so that it's right sides together with the band in between. And pin that in place. Doing that on both sides. Now starting at one center front bottom edge, we're going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance right over that folded portion and all across that front band, around the neckline, and right back down the opposite center front bottom edge. Once that's sewn, finish your seams in your preferred method. And then turn your bands out, as well as the bottom edge of the bodice, on both sides. And then for the bottom hem of the garment, I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press a crease all the way across to match the 1.5 inch hem that we started at the corners. Once you have that hem in place, you have a couple of options for how you're going to sew it. You could use a needle and thread to catch some fabric of this serged edge, followed by a little bit of garment at the bottom of the bodice along that hemline, alternating this hand sewing in a zigzag formation, catching just a little bit of fiber at the bottom of that bodice so that your needle does not exit the outside of the garment will make it so that the stitch is invisible. Alternatively, you could use a blind hem stitch and a blind hem foot to complete this hem. I'm going to do this method. I'm going to fold this folded section back so that this new folded edge lies just below my serging stitches by about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. And I'm going to pin that in place. Then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew from one edge of the facing all the way across to the edge of the facing on the opposite side. Now with our bands pressed out and away from the garment, and once again those seam allowances pressed toward the bodice, we're going to top stitch along the outer edge of the bodice about 1/4 of an inch away from that original seam. So we're going to be sewing that seam allowance to the front of the bodice from one bottom edge all the way around the neckline and back down to the opposite bottom edge. Fold your sleeves in half right sides together and pin the underarm seam. Do this for both sleeves. Sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seams. At the tops of your sleeve, you have dots transferred from your pattern piece that indicate where to match the sleeve with your shoulder seams. I've marked those dots here with pins. You also have notches on either side of the sleeve that indicate front and back. Match your sleeves right sides together with its corresponding armhole. Pin in place at the underarm seam, also matching your notches and the dot at the top of your sleeve with your shoulder seam. And pin in place all the way around. And do this for both sleeves. And then sew both of the armholes with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seams. For the bottoms of both sleeves, I've taken them to my serger and I've finished the raw edges all the way around. I also folded up that bottom hem by 1.5 inches and gave that a good press all the way around. Now we're going to hem the bottoms of the sleeves in the same way as we hemmed the bottom of the jacket. You can either blind stitch using a needle and thread, or you can fold back this bottom section, pin around the bottom, and use your machine to do the blind hem stitch, repeating whichever method you chose for the bottoms of both sleeves. And now your jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.